Welcome everyone to the Global Online Content Series. This is episode 4, brought to you by RedTech. Thank you for joining us from so many parts of the world. It was really exciting when I was looking at where you are, where you're watching from. There's so many of you on LinkedIn, and many of you on YouTube, and so many of you also on the RedTech website and here on StreamYard. Delighted to have you join us. You are, in fact, the most important component of this webinar, because we're expecting your questions to really make this a rich experience for you. And that's why we've got an incredible panel for you today. I'm going to introduce them right now. As you know, this particular topic today is about trends in content for audio. And so we've asked Sarah Van Mosel to join us. She's SVP Podcast Strategy for Sirius XM. I've got to consult my notes because these guys are a high-powered panel, and I don't want to get anything wrong. Fabulous career, including with iHeart in the US as an advisor, and a considerable amount of time running the commercial strategy at various digital audio businesses as chief revenue officer. So as you're watching, one of the things you could be looking to Sarah for is questions about how you make money with your digital footprint. I know that it's a challenge. I know that you're up against the global giants, but can you still make money? She's got great ideas. She's been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Geoff Lloyd, he's a great on-air talent, one of the best, actually. I voted him best morning show when I was a judge at the NAB Europe in Barcelona in 2007. And it was because of his incredible interview with Paul McCartney, an interview like I've never heard before in my life. Because he knew Paul had been interviewed a few thousand times. So what could he do differently? Well, trust me, he did. Find that if you can. And then I invited him to South Africa. Yeah?
It was also the envelope of cash that I sent to you, Omar.
Oh, yeah.
I hope it had some bearing on the decision.
Why did you send them in Nigerian Naira? I mean, it couldn't do anything with it. Then I invited him to South Africa to coach drive show talent when I was at Kagiso Media, and he was at Absolute Radio at the time. Today, Geoff's a podcaster. He's got a show called Reasons to be Cheerful, and he continues to host radio shows for the BBC. And Michael Fischer is VP for Business Development at SoundStack, and this webinar would not be possible without SoundStack. So thank you, Scott and the team, for making it happen. But he's not on the panel because of that. He's on the panel because he's got a deep appreciation for content strategy and audience engagement. And that's honed during his time as an SVP for engagement and for music and content strategy at various businesses along the way. So thank you, panel, for being here today. We're going to obviously talk about the big challenges that radio broadcasters around the world and audio players are facing. And one of the discussions we had prior to this, while we were planning this webinar, was this view that so many of you had, that the biggest challenger for audio was probably YouTube. People were just, in droves using that as their primary medium for content, whether it was video, but treating it as an audio medium as well. So our question then is, if they're so dominant, both video and audio, what does it mean for those of us that run online and on-air linear media today? How do we challenge ourselves to change our strategies, to adjust, to adapt, maybe to collaborate? Let's start with you, Sarah, on this issue of the primacy of YouTube and what it means for all of us.
For sure. I think it's been a quick change. I think as you follow some of the research from folks like Edison Media, Signal Hill Insights here in the US, you can see how YouTube very quickly became the #1 podcast listening platform in the US. And it's the #1 place where folks are discovering new podcasts. And the interesting thing is, you can take two attitudes about it, right? You can see it as something you have to defend against, and, how is audio going to fight against YouTube? Or you could just see it as a gift of a distribution mechanism for your content creators, right? And I choose to look at it in the latter way. Instead of viewing creators as inherent to one platform or another, I think there's also been a shift where creators are creators, and we're starting to get very creative, to reuse that word again, to figure out how best to distribute their content and how best to court the listener or the consumer or the viewer wherever they are, right? So if you have a huge ocean full of consumers that are fishing around for something to pique their interest, why wouldn't you put your content there? And if the audio medium is better suited to being on the go, if it's on demand, or something that's live and timely and in the moment like radio, well, then you plan your content creation accordingly. So I think we embrace the ascendance of YouTube and sort of figure out the best way to harness it for growth of the audio side of our business.
Okay, well, I hope there's a contrarian view somewhere. Geoff, I'm looking at you. But before I get to that, before I get to you, just hold your thoughts.
Sorry.
I want to ask those of you that are watching, please don't feel that you have to wait till the end of this webinar to pose your questions. There is an opportunity, if you're on StreamYard, to put your comments in, and then we flash them on screen, and then one of the panel will take up that question and deal with it. And if you're on LinkedIn, there are also ways for you to pop your question in to ask any of the panel about anything you want to know, including stuff we haven't discussed. There might be questions you have for them that we're not dealing with. Feel free to do that whenever it strikes you. Geoff.
Yeah, I'm not going to be contrarian on this occasion. I'm maybe wouldn't get too fixated on it being YouTube, because as Sarah says, it's YouTube at the moment in the US. Here in the UK, I'm pretty sure that the pecking order is still Apple Podcasts at the top and then Spotify. But whatever platform it is, these things are jostling, and there'll be a new one in a year, and the landscape will look different in 5 years. I think something that radio maybe hasn't been good at in terms of mentality as a broadcaster is thinking it does something other than send stuff up into a transmitter and then out into the world. And it might have got into a place where, okay, it's a transmitter, but it's also streaming on the internet, and it's also DAB radio is a big part of the landscape in Europe. But it's about understanding that these platforms are all the same thing, and you have to do as Sarah says, you have to follow the audience, you have to follow their behavior. They will select the platforms they're going to listen to things on. It's a shame that radio kind of was slow to adapt and missed the trick and wasn't the leader in developing those platforms, but that's not where we are. I think that it's about making sure that what you do is in all those places, but perhaps even more than that, thinking about something that's really exciting that we can miss when, certainly in Europe, you see this video listening. You can feel that the business of radio is managing decline, whereas something to be excited about is there's more ears on audio than there ever were, and people are finding ways to make audio parts of their life and fill gaps that maybe weren't possible before. My wife listens to the New York Times Daily while she brushes her teeth, and it's figuring out what the listener behaviors are and then putting the stuff that they're going to love in the places where they're choosing to go and find that stuff.
I'm sure Michael Barbaro will be impressed that she's doing this while brushing her teeth. But he's the host of The Daily, by the way. For anybody
she's got very clean teeth.
Well informed.
Very unusual here in Britain.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I am going to get to how. So if you push all of this out through every channel available to you, how do you monetize it, or do you lose? How much do you lose by doing that? But before I get there, I want to hear Michael's view. And then also, sorry, one more thing. I know that, Pedro, you're patient. You have a question. We're going to flash that question onto the screen as soon as Michael's done. Go ahead, Michael.
I think a couple of things. I think the growth of YouTube came from its derived, integration with Google, right? And discoverability was the number one challenge for podcasters. There's so many podcasts. So discoverability and search capabilities is what I believe propelled YouTube to the forefront. I remember going to podcast movements very early on, and the first time Kai Chuck spoke, people packed the room because they wanted to hear what the orientation was going to be for YouTube on how they were going to handle podcasts. So I think that Google search, for one, it made a lot of sense to be able to search for podcast content using Google on YouTube. That was the first thing, and helping with discoverability. To Geoff's point about, traditional media, linear media, they were, for many years in the history of radio, they were in a bubble and controlled the conversation with the audience. And then new technology, like the minute we saw the freemium model come out for music with LimeWire and Kazaa and Napster, and music got devalued that way through ubiquitous sharing and be able to share people's hard drives of music and things like that. Radio kind of lost control because music became a diminished commodity. So I think that radio now, at least here in the States, is that people are tasked with having to create more points of distribution as part of a job that they weren't necessarily trained for. That puts pressure on the staff. But I think in general, I think that Geoff is dead on. We have to be everywhere to meet the listener at their expectation. The issue is that they have 500 places that they can go now. And the reason why audio consumption is up is because there's more distribution, more easy distribution. Obviously, the ubiquitous proliferation of the mobile phone changed that, to be able to take it on the go, phones to be more, compatible with traveling audio. So there's been a lot of things technologically that put that downward pressure on. But then just going back to YouTube as a visual medium, podcasters now are starting to realize it's a bifurcated strategy. You have to do audio and video, and certain people like to only listen to audio. I tend to spend more time with video. Everybody's different. So again, going back to YouTube, it was really Google search that propelled that. And then now with transcription happening, it's becoming even more important.
Okay. So here's Pedro's question on the screen, or comment. Actually, it is a question. He's from Canada. YouTube, you can see it there. YouTube has potential for 2 or 3 person chat casts. How can other podcast formats transition to video?
It's a great question.
I think I can jump in here. So YouTube is perfect for chat, and that's why you see it's easy to do. It's an easy distribution mechanism. The same way, particularly during the pandemic, it was easy for folks to start podcasts because they were home and microphones were pretty easy and you could get it up and distributed pretty easily. It is tougher to take a show, for example, like 99% Invisible, which is part of our network. This is a show all about the good design, right? And it is, an episode can take 6 months to 9 months to research and produce and create. It's not like there is an episode every week, but the production sort of life cycle is a lot longer. So with a show like that, your approach to video is not so much an exact distribution of the episode, but it could be teases. It could be investing in tentpole moments throughout the year where you're investing in a visual representation of a theme or a series of episodes that, let's say there's a series that they're working on now about climate change, and they did invest in some visual artists to sort of bring some animation to life. That works for 99% Invisible because that's what that audience expects. They have a very high level of expectation around the quality of the output from that show. I'm sure that folks will distribute the full audio with just an image, but for them, if you want to meet those expectations and bring it to that next level, it's really a different strategy for a show like that than it would be for a chat show. And that's not to say that the chat show is less valuable or has less monetary potential. It just means that the output for each medium should meet the audience's expectations wherever they are, if that makes sense.
Sarah, can I ask you, with a show like that, or just generally, do you have much of a sense of whether people are using YouTube in lieu of a traditional podcast app? So thinking about driving or cooking, something where your eyes aren't going to be on your screen. It'd be quite interesting to get some understanding on how much people are using YouTube for pure audio, and then of course something needs to be on the screen, and that you know what to do with that with a show like 99% Invisible is an interesting question. But I'm wondering, my son's really crazy about the Lord of the Rings, and he will listen to, they're essentially podcasts, but they're on YouTube. You know, some guy talking about whether orcs have wives or whatever, and you know, every 15 seconds the image will change on the screen, and it's some bit of, I don't know if it's AI artwork or fan artwork that he's found on the internet, but yeah, it almost feels like the visual in that situation is a placeholder. And because these things get loads of views, by the way, like in hundreds of thousands of views, it makes me wonder if people are using YouTube a bit more like a conventional audio app.
Yeah, so there's two things. One, with 99% Invisible, because it's a legacy show, meaning it was around way before YouTube became a thing, most of their audience is concentrated on Apple, right? So that's an older audience. They have a set habit. They're used to consuming 99% Invisible via that method, right? I think what we're seeing with expectations, particularly with younger, more diverse demographics, is they go to YouTube first because that's where they're used to finding new things. And once they find something, they will then, and we're looking at data around the transfer level, like the percentage of finding it on YouTube and then going and following it on an audio app so they can take it with them on their way. But we have seen evidence of that happening. Now, the $1 million question is, how do you make it happen rather than observe it happening and cross your fingers, right? That's like the challenge at hand. But I think the nature of a show, again, the expectations of the audience, right? If you want to hear about Lord of the Rings, and you can find images of it anywhere, and be careful because it's also copyrighted. So that's a thing that you need to consider when you're an actual business. But when a show like 99% Invisible, or even if I go back to my earliest days in podcasting, a show like Radio Lab, for example. So this came out of WNYC Studios. Both have their roots in public radio in the US, which is tends to have bigger budgets, a little bit more leeway in terms of creativity. They tend to have very high quality because they have a long runway for creation and big staffs, right? Radiolab also commissioned artists, and usually they were fans, listeners, right? That would create things, often videos, animation, all kinds of great things, after being inspired by their show. So there was an episode about what happens to the body of a whale once it dies and it rests on the sea floor. And these really, really creative folks made a sort of animation out of paper, like just moving paper around, and they had the little crabs and they had all the things, and they literally showed all the stages of a whale's body decomposing at the bottom of the ocean in a beautiful video that then got shared around and became okay, this is something that we can call on our very creative audience to lean into. And that's just a strategy of authentically getting that earned media and sharing it around. Now, that doesn't make sense necessarily for a couple of comedians who are daily checking in on pop culture and headlines and things like that. There's a much shorter shelf life, but a more prolific amount of content that's coming out of a format like that, which is probably better suited to a couple of cameras and a mic.
But let me draw you guys back to the question that if I'm a radio owner, wherever I am in the world, I remember in the early days when Facebook became a thing, I wanted to be there, had to be there because I wanted to grow my reach. Everybody was there. I gave up a lot, is what I keep hearing, because who owned all of that data when audiences moved there? I didn't. Did they come back? I didn't know if I could close that loop either. There wasn't a guarantee that I was doing that. So what am I losing by being on every available distribution medium? Or am I in a position right now where I don't have a choice. I just have to do that. But I'm not monetized. I mean, how do you monetize? So let's answer those questions for those that are watching from around the world. Is it necessary? What do I lose? What can I gain? Who wants to take that?
I can jump in. I know, Michael, you have a lot that you can bring to the table in terms of monetization across networks. I think nowadays it's a very competitive market to get publishers to use your platform as their primary home, right? So the thing that will often draw folks to us is that we can monetize their inventory, both through direct sales and through network sales or programmatic sales. The other thing that we're doing on YouTube is that Sirius XM has an MCN, or a multi-channel network, that is made up of shows in our network that have a video component that are now a part of our YouTube network. Not only do they benefit from the regular YouTube AdSense inventory that would be cycling through their show if they just independently went on there, but we can sell their show individually as part of our network at a premium rate, and they can benefit from that as well. So they're not losing anything by becoming a part of our multi-channel network. And if anything, it's additive. So wherever you go, like, there are monetization. I think now at this point in time, there's never been better monetization opportunities for creators, because it's such a widely distributed universe, and everyone, wherever you go, is monetizing that inventory. And we're at that point in our sort of evolution where the creator is getting a cut of it in every platform where they're going.
Yeah, I would also like to add a couple of things here. I think Sarah's right. I think there's even what we do at SoundStack, we have a monetization platform, and we can create what we call these supply packs or supply buckets, where we can segment out certain types of shows and get very targeted advertising. And we can put podcasters or broadcasters into those supply packs. But I also think you brought up something interesting. When Facebook first came out, and particularly in the US, a lot of people said, I'll never talk about it. It's free promotion. They're not spending any money on my radio station. Well, I would never talk about someone unless I was getting some sort of trade or they were buying a schedule. And then what happened was they quickly came to realize you have to talk about it. It was a cultural flashpoint that everybody was involved. People weren't talking about MySpace really too much on the radio when it started. But when Facebook came along and it jiggered the model, everyone kind of woke up and said, okay. So then you started to think, well, how can I monetize this, right? Is it product placement? When I do a Facebook Live, I can't embed my Facebook Lives on my website. So it's a controlled environment. Do I do product placement? Do I sell a step and repeat behind me? People were trying to get creative with ways that they could monetize social media. And did it become a revenue line? I really don't think so. Overall, it didn't become a major revenue line. But what they came to quickly understand is that they needed to be on Insta, they needed to be on TikTok, they needed to be on Facebook, because they had to meet the audience where they were. And I guess in the context of radio, and again, trying to figure out what is the value of a commercial on radio these days, the world is shrinking, right? Because there's fewer and fewer people listening from one central location. They're scattered all over the place. So the economic impact is now starting to put that downward pressure on the sales teams on commercial radio. But I think Sarah's absolutely right. Those who are doing digital correctly, and there's a lot of different ways that companies in the States here are monetizing. Some have set up distributed services. They build websites and newsletters for small businesses. And they use that as ancillary revenue. There's several companies in the US that do that well. But individual stations realize they have to be everywhere all the time. And that if you have a monetization network plugged into the back end of your distribution on podcasting, or if it's a display network on your website, there are ways to make money there programmatically. The challenge for most radio companies here in the States, and I'd love to hear from Geoff about it as well for global, is boots on the ground. Sarah has one tremendous advantage. She has boots on the ground selling Sirius XM, and she has programmatic. That's the ideal combination. Unfortunately, not everybody can do that, but that's one unique value proposition that they have. And, we do programmatic advertising. We don't have boots on the ground, but we still send a substantial amount of money to our publishers.
Just
I think. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead,
one
Sarah.
additional thought. When it comes to monetizing in environments where you don't necessarily have control, I think podcasting was kind of the poster child for figuring that out early and taking control of it through baked-in host-read endorsement ads.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of podcasting in particular is that they don't own the platform. It's a widely distributed platform, right? So it's on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's on all these little podcatchers wherever you listen to podcasts, right? So podcasters very early on had to figure out, how do I maximize the listening that's happening to my show that I made and I'm paying for, and control that revenue path. And the way they did it was with baked-in ads. And that was essentially having the host as part of the show, or later on through dynamic ad insertion, which they also controlled through an RSS feed. The nature of the RSS feed was really the thing that allowed podcasting to not wither on the vine. It was able to have its monetization follow it wherever it was consumed, which is unique to a digital platform. Usually, like YouTube, it's fixed in one platform, and that's where the whole ecosystem lives. Now, live by the RSS feed, die by the RSS feed, because it's virtually impossible to guarantee listening across all of those platforms. You can't say, yes, your ad was consumed, and here's proof, and here's a report, and I'm tying it all up in a nice, beautiful bow, and here's your insertion order that ties back to all the other media that you bought from me. So we've had to be a little wily about how we measure and what our standards are in the podcast space. And so we're seeing that now also as podcasting goes into YouTube. They're reverting back to those same tactics to keep that money. You know, what you bake into your content that is a part of that video file is yours, and YouTube has allowed it, as long as it's not using the AdSense system to dynamically insert, unless you have an agreement with them and you have a multi-channel network. But it's interesting. What's old is new again when it comes to how podcasting is behaving with monetization on YouTube.
Live reads, imagine that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
1950 all over again.
Yeah, but like you say, it works. Geoff, it's a good time to bring you in. So, as somebody who's worked fairly recently and still works with radio broadcasters, what do you think they're getting right? What do you think you would do if you were running a radio station and you're surrounded by all of these new opportunities, these new audio opportunities, the fact that you have shareholders that you've got to deliver a return to? What are they getting right when it comes to the strategy, and what do you think should change?
Well, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because in a shareholder model, long-term planning can sometimes be incredibly difficult. You kind of live or die by those quarterly results, both financial and in terms of audience. I think a way in which radio maybe lost ground is what you're describing, Omar, which is that there was this social media mentality that if we can use social media as a funnel, which is what it was at the time, to get people to listen to what comes out of our transmitters or what we stream from our server, then that's the advantage of being there. And what's the world we're living in now, in this multi-platform be everywhere, is you don't always get to own how your content is sold anymore. And there has to be some kind of acceptance of that's the world we live in. And it's nice to be the only the only widget shop in town, but also it's really nice having a bit of real estate in every mall in the world which sells widgets, and then kind of figuring out what to do with that. So that's kind of the sort of shift in mentality, I guess. And then there are things like baked-in ads, like Sarah mentions, and premium as well. If you get people to really like something, Sirius is a great example of this. So people like audio so much that they pay a subscription to Sirius. And actually, podcasts could be a good way to get people hooked enough to buy a Sirius subscription. And then on the other side, like Sirius XM could be a good platform to get people to pay for double premium and some sort of extra bonus content that they're not getting from the radio. And I promise you this isn't a pitch, Sarah, because I own none of the IP, and I would stand to make nothing of this. But I do a show for the Beatles channel, which is the Sirius XM station over there. And every month we'll go and record these interviews with, it might be one of Monty Python, or it might be Ozzy Osbourne, and they'll talk about their love of the Beatles. And then because it's radio, it gets edited down from an hour to 7 or 8 minutes, or whatever feels okay in an hour of music radio. So with a content like that, for example, you could either use that content which you own, presumably Sirius own, to get Beatles fans hooked on a Sirius subscription, or you could use listeners to the Beatles channel. You could sell them that as a premium offering. So there's lots of ways that I think the stuff you're making, you can retain some control of how it's sold or how it's monetized. I think, sort of broadly speaking, like as somebody who has spent a career mainly in radio and these days primarily makes podcasts, it's sometimes difficult to understand what radio can offer me as a podcaster. So BBC Sounds is its own thing here in the UK, and that's a platform which I think can really amplify ideas and podcasts. But I had a situation recently where I went to talk to a media owner about an idea, and the sort of risk and reward balance was all off. So they wanted me to do something for an amount of money that was less than how I value my time, and the potential reward is a revenue split. But what they weren't offering is any ingenuity on how to amplify it and make that revenue split more likely than it would be if I did it independently. So radio, you've been in a nice position. Like I can think of like 100 million reasons why the smartless guys might want to sign a deal with a radio station. But I think radio, if it wants to land grab some of this listening space, it needs to think, what can it, if it can't offer, it hasn't got deep enough money to offer endless money to podcasters, what else can it offer? So maybe some production support. I mean, arguably with video, that's more appealing or difficult to do than just audio. But more than that, radio stations are like real experts in marketing. They're real experts in talking to their listeners. They're real experts in cross-promoting to listeners and creating brands that mean something to people's lives. And I think that's an attractive prospect to an independent podcaster. That's a way to get those ears back to radio stations, because it would offer podcasters amplification.
That's exactly. It's like you're reading from the playbook. So we have this abundance of riches when it comes to content creators at Sirius, because we have an entire, hundreds of actual radio stations. And then when we acquired Stitcher in 2020, we acquired this podcast network, right? And so the interesting thing is, instead of the first few years of that acquisition where they kind of lived independently and they did their own things and occasionally they would cross over, the vibe now is like tear down the walls between the two. What can we do together? A perfect example of this is there's a TikTok personality named Tinks, right? She's the internet's big sister. And Tinks was huge on TikTok, gathering a young female audience, which we didn't have so much on the radio side. And when we did a deal with Tinks, our deal was multi-platform. It was, Tinks is going to do a weekly call-in radio show, because guess what? Tinks is going to solve your relationship problems. And what's better for doing that than live call-in radio, right? That's when radio is at its best. So you take this personality and you say, how can we use each of these platforms in the best way possible to enhance what you do? She has a twice a week podcast, right? So she's still reaching and feeding that habit of being in people's minds and hearts. And then she's regularly on TikTok and YouTube. So it's like, okay, that was one of the first times we really took that leap. She wasn't a huge personality in the world, but she was definitely big in her space. And by sort of opening up the possibilities of what we had to offer to this talent, we really like expanded her audience. She's now, got a radio show. She's doing a podcast. She's doing all these things, and she's expanding her audience beyond this niche on TikTok, which she had and she was the queen of. She still is. But like, who else would love to hear what she has to say? And maybe even stretch that advice. She's a single 30-something-year-old, and she's got thoughts on lots of things. But when she has this call in, we don't get young female callers to Sirius XM unless it's something like this. And to make her part of a channel which is Radio Andy. So Andy Cohen, who is the founder and creator of all of the Real Housewives franchises, that's a welcoming place for her content to live, and she can tap into and sort of age down a little bit that engagement there. So that was one swing that we took on a creator, where we said, let's pull out all the stops and just bring every platform to bear in support of this creator.
And you gave her a reason to go to radio, because I just think a lot of the time, what is the reason to go to radio for young creators? And live is it's infuriating to me that live radio, something unfolding as it's happening, alongside a news event, a cultural event, a sport event. That's something no platform has cracked actually, apart from radio. But that's not to say they won't. They all dip their toe in it, and some more successfully than others. But at the moment, radio can still do that better than any other platform. And yet, so much of radio now, I guess for economic reasons, isn't live anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to go back to something Geoff said too about what radio can offer. Radio is all about creating that live and local connection. And so I've worked with a client in the past that had a syndicated radio show nationally, and then they created a podcast. And then now their digital audience is actually bigger than their broadcast audience. And what they've done is they've created not just one podcast, but like 3 or 4. Each one of them dive off into specialty topics. But then the other thing they do is they fly around the country and they go into these markets and they do live events around the audience that's listening to the podcast, and also listening on the stations as a companion thing. So, and not only are they doing, local things in local markets, but they're also doing things like subscriptions. Like they have a cookbook, they have a adult coloring book. They have, I've talked to them about possibly doing a subscription box, because there's all these different ways that they now have this captive audience, and that they're building a one-to-one relationship with their podcasting audience through a various set of data collection tools that they're now getting names and phone numbers and addresses that they can now take that. Their crazy cat book, pictures of cats, or their adult coloring book sold out. Cooking with Cats is one of them.
Yeah.
And it's Bob and Sherry, and Sherry wrote a cookbook, and it sells like crazy. So they're trying all kinds of different ways to merch outside. There are artists, and there are others that have Patreon channels, and they're trying to do subscription to get people to pay for additional content. I had a call with the station the other day that said to me, we're thinking about doing some paid podcasts on the side through a paywall. And incidentally, the podcast I just talked about also has paid content through a paywall. So they have a lot of different things going on. They have merch going on. They have local appearances going on, and they have paid content that they're offering online.
And if radio was able to offer amplification or whatever it was, or even financial deals to podcasters, then those creators, the deals they do would offer up a share of all that kind of revenue and ways of leveraging that IP that weren't part of the radio's business model. So if your panic is, we look at broadcast advertising sales and it's in decline. Well, all these other ways in which digital creators are making money, that with correctly structured deals, radio could be taking in some of that
Yeah, for sure. For us, radio is a subscription play, 100%. So it's kind of exciting because things that drive new subscribers are shiny new objects, right? So that comes in most part from the podcast world and outside of the radio world. So
not really a question from Diane, but she's delighted at the conversation, which is also nice to send to you guys, right? So that you know that what you're offering. And I'm sorry that this comment is long. So Michael, you're kind of blocked off screen, but I won't keep it there forever. So just for a little while, we can't see you. Right? Just see the top. Just see the top of that glorious head of hair. That's all we can see at the moment. So she says, excellent discussion. Thank you. Listening from South Africa, a market which still has to realize its full potential in terms of podcast audiences. Years behind in this respect. By the way, the reason I'm reading it because there might be some people who are not watching but are listening. So that's why I'm doing this. And many are still trying to figure out the monetization strategy. We're also having YouTube debate discussion. So this is especially relevant. So it means we're getting to the right people. They're getting value out of this discussion. So I just wanted to post that so you're aware that you're actually doing something that people need. That people need. And there you are, Michael. You're back now. Yeah, I do think that was a fabulous discussion, but it takes us back to what you were saying earlier then, Geoff. Radio's not fully embraced this, even in markets where the potential is great. So South Africa, as they say, still a growing, nascent market for audio on demand and podcasting. But markets where it's mature, the UK, the US, some other markets, radio broadcasters themselves, are they too stuck in a particular paradigm? They're not exploring this sufficiently? Is that the problem?
Yes, and there's a great opportunity to look at the strange evolution and missed opportunities of podcasting in European countries or North America in terms of the way that radio failed to spot the rising sea level or whatever. There's an opportunity to skip those steps and move straight to the kind of collaborations that we're talking about here and the distribution that we're talking about here. I think
one thing to note though about the evolution of the podcast industry in the US is that it didn't start with corporate radio. It started as indie, that people just comedians, right? Some public radio, which they have other reasons for doing it, primarily donations and sort of serving that audience in a different way. But in the early stages, these were independent creators, not affiliated with a radio station, that really rose to high heights. And when you look at it now, everything has gone to these corporate networks because we acquired them, right? Yes. They didn't come from us. We saw them and said, "Oh, we can complement what you're currently doing. Come and join us so that we can amplify." So it could be, I wouldn't feel bad that podcasting hasn't blossomed as much in a market where there maybe isn't as much opportunity to develop that indie sort of grassroots development of the content. But that's where I would look to, because that's really how it came about here in the US.
So talking about that, just for each of you, and if you don't have one, you don't have to contribute to this, but are you seeing people who are outside radio and audio, or maybe even in radio and audio, doing things that surprise and delight you that you think people should copy? What's worth copying out there? Michael, you had some story about TikTok. I mean, I think you already.
Well, yeah. So, and it pays little my respect to Sirius XM, which I have in my car. I'm fascinated by TikTok radio as a radio broadcaster because it kind of violates all the expectations and the rules of what we thought radio was, right? Like having people on from 6 to 10, 10 to 3, 3 to 7, rotating promos and not chopping songs or speeding them up. I mean, it literally violates every expectation of what you would expect a radio station in the US to sound like. And it sounds it's amazing. I'm riveted every time I turn it on because one, they have influencers that are talking about things that are emerging in a parallel universe, which is TikTok, but they're talking about it on the radio. So they when an influencer comes on and says, hey, this is trending on TikTok, and it's relevant, it's really relevant because it's content that's live and dynamic that's happening on another platform. But also their approach towards music and how they're playing, how everything is shorter and more condensed. And it's just really built for this attention deficit world that we live in of 2 minutes of attention. And I understand that the way those channels are built on Sirius XM, and Sarah could talk about that, is that TikTok actually has 50% ownership in it. So they have skin in the game. But it's a brilliant representation of trying to do something different. And I really believe that if it was ever put on commercial radio, it would pose a serious threat to top 40 radio, because they're taking a chance that they can get away with because of the size of the brand and its distribution on Sirius XM. But I think if anybody hasn't listened, you really should pay attention, because I think that kind of sets the tone for breaking the barriers. I think commercial radio, particularly here in the States, with all the downward pressure, we see what's happening with a lot of companies with layoffs and cutbacks and budgets and the economy. I think, they've trimmed their business because they have to keep it running, and creativity typically gets stifled in that. Now, there are radio stations that are doing a brilliant job. Z100 in New York is magnificent, right? KISS FM in Los Angeles. There are that top 1% that do great jobs, but it's everybody else below them that's having a bit of a hard time, because they either don't have the personality structure on the radio station. You have Ryan Seacrest doing your morning show, or Elvis Duran doing your morning show. It's very easy to go to another platform and do something very exciting. But most radio stations not in that. But I would highly suggest, just as a former radio program director, listen to TikTok radio, see what they're doing, and don't be afraid to try something new, although it's easier said than done because of the financial stakes involved. But
thank you for that shout out, Michael.
It's true. It's a really interesting, compelling, and maybe you can go into it more about the effect the channels had across the network.
Yeah, no, it's definitely aged down listening, right? So it definitely appeals. Just the brand TikTok does wonders for interest, right, from a younger audience. I think there's one thing to think about, and this is sort of how we're thinking about it now, and it may be a little spicy, but if someone is talking, they're an influencer, right? So we're treating all of our talent like influencers. And there are ways to... I also really believe in the ability. Now, YouTube may be the number one place where people are discovering new content, new podcast content in the US, but the number two way is to get a recommendation from a friend, right? So most of our new show development moving forward in 2025 is going to be around this flywheel effect of how can the shows that are currently with us, that we work with, pull up new things that we're doing. And there's a couple of ways that we're going about that. And they derive from an experience I had when I was working with PRX and Radiotopia back in the day. So there's this amazing show called Ear Hustle, right? It's about, it's produced by, and the hosts of it are prisoners at San Quentin in San Francisco. It's a prison. And it just talks about the day-to-day life. It really humanizes what it's like to have that experience. But before the show came out, it was a part of this podcast collective called Radiotopia. And the week that it was going to launch, all of the shows within Radiotopia, I think there were like 12 or 14 at that time, and they were very different genres. There were crime shows, 99% Invisible was part of it. They had Song Exploder, West Wing Weekly. All of the shows in the collective decided that for that week, they were going to release an episode on the concept, on the theme of doing time. Now, it didn't have to be about prison. One of them did something about time travel. One did something about their grandfather's watch. But that week, when that show launched, all of these podcasts released an episode about doing time and said, and by the way, Ear Hustle's launching as a part of our, and because there was audience overlap with all of the shows in that network, if you were a listener to any of them, it really felt like something big and important in your world was going on. And how perfect, right? It launched, it got Pulitzer Prizes, it was huge, and it was so well received because it was birthed into the world in this really ideal way, right? So I took that experience and I'm bringing it over here and trying to apply that as we build up content verticals within our network. And as we cross over from radio to podcasting to social or wherever, the best way, like we have all of these tools that cost nothing. They're just about synergy. And I know it's such a corporate buzzword, but when it works, it's almost magical. So that's a thing that, and it has to be authentic. Again, another buzzword, but my job is to create an environment where that can be real, and to go forth and create circumstances where that can happen. We're doing something this year or this coming year called the Cross-Pollination Project. So this is where any of the shows within our podcast network can do a short collaboration with any other show. It doesn't have to be in our network. It could be a radio show. It could be a competitor, whatever. If the content that they're working on together is aligned and it makes sense for both of those shows and the teams are excited about doing it together, they're going to do a collaboration. There's no contracts, there's no budget. It's simply, we were going to do an episode anyway, let's do it together. They release it into each of their feeds and they mutually benefit. Both shows get that added inventory for monetization, and they cross-pollinate each other's audiences. So it's a gift to that audience. They can really, in a way that like a promo or like a feed drop just isn't going to cut it. This is an endorsement at the highest level of content of a colleague. And so that kind of experimentation is the thinking that we're bringing into the next year. And again, not limited to podcast creators only, right? How can we be creative there? And that's how we're trying to sort of stir up real interest and recreate that magic that I saw with.
Well, we're just about 9 minutes to go. I'm glad you mentioned tools.
Yeah.
Because we want to talk about some of them. Gen AI, there's a lot of hype. Some of it is real. Some of it might be valuable. I want to just walk through you guys. Start with you, Michael. What tools should radio and audio companies be thinking about that they may
it's
not
a great
be using
question, and we talked about that a little bit earlier before. I think that there's some great morning show prep tools out there right now. There's a number of services that you can use to help you create content for a morning show. I think that's a no-brainer. I think that when we used to do show prep in the old days, it was a lot of searching anyway. Now that it's been consolidated into these dashboards that can provide you with potential breaks and topics, phenomenal concept. And I love it. There's a number of companies out there that do it. I also think transcription, we talked about transcription for podcasting. I think using generative AI for that is critical, because we all know that transcriptions can lead to a lot of other forms of engagement and keyword search. So I think that's being done very well. So I think those are two areas for me that I would definitely keep an eye open on. I mean, one is internal to the workings of the radio station. The other one is for podcasting. But I think those are two great examples of how to use generative AI today, immediately, to help enhance what you're doing.
What are you using, Geoff?
The only bit of, I use Descript, which is some editing software, and I don't use too many of the AI features, but sometimes if I'm editing and I notice a flub and I'm too lazy to walk up the 2 flights of stairs to my studio, I will get the AI to generate whatever I was saying, only more clearly and without the flub. And then, sometimes I'll put a sponsorship brief for a host read into ChatGPT just to get it to spew out a first draft. I haven't, figured out the right prompt, or maybe it's not there yet for giving me anything that's actually usable, but just the kind of spade work of having to digest the information and get it into the right shape. I think it can be useful in that way. As we've been having this conversation, I wondered about the role that AI could potentially play in distribution. If there is a resource issue for content creators, radio stations, in making sure that their content is in so many different platforms, that feels like something that AI could potentially solve. Also, I guess, if you're not lucky enough to be Radiotopia and your listeners aren't generating fantastic art for your YouTube podcasts, which aren't just kind of talk shows, then maybe, although, I mean, it's an ethical minefield, isn't it, sort of AI for art creation, but maybe there's some way in which AI could generate the visuals for that. I think you know, what it can potentially do with translation is very exciting at some point. And I also was just thinking about what Michael was saying about live radio and what radio stations have had to do through necessity. So I feel like a lot of commercial radio, wouldn't it be lovely to have the luxury of launching TikTok radio, where the listeners don't have an expectation and you can surprise them with something brand new? But most legacy stations, say you're a rock station that's been around for 30 or 40 years, you've kind of had to paint yourself into a corner through the 90s and noughties, where to keep a broadcast audience engaged, you have to play non-stop music pretty much that appeals to the biggest cross-section of people, and you've got your hosts saying very little. That was Led Zeppelin, isn't it? A Beautiful Morning here in London, and coming up next it's Coldplay. And it feels like maybe AI could be used to keep the lights on for some of that stuff, while you get the talent that you have on your roster to do more interesting things. So at some point, a rock station like that would be a brand that fans loved, because fans are passionate about something, and they would hear a long form interview, or they'd have a host who'd be able to tell you a long history of a band, or do storytelling. And commercial radio, music commercial radio especially, has painted itself into a corner where if it tried to do that, the listeners think, why aren't you playing music? Why don't you just shut up and turn off? So you could use AI to keep the lights on in doing that, and then use that talent you've got. Like Michael and I were talking about this last time we spoke. Some of the videos on YouTube, like an hour and a half, 2 hour long deep dives into very specific aspects of where there's a fandom. So for me, it would be the Beatles. I'm not going to listen to a radio station that plays the 50 most popular Beatles songs and doesn't give me information, when I can curate my own Spotify and listen to a podcast which is 2 hours long about what Ringo had for breakfast on a particular day in 1968. So AI, maybe you could use it to keep the lights on the radio while you engage the talent that you have on your roster to do more interesting things and tap into their passions, and put that out into the world, and have those what were trusted legacy brands become something that fans love again. But it's just not what's coming out of your transmitter into an FM or AM and DAB radio. It's coming out of all these other fantastic platforms that we've talked about.
It was a scone, by the way. And so, Sarah,
I've got some quick hits. First, the name of some AI software that can generate images to go along with your transcript is called Midjourney. There are some other ones out there, and a lot of folks are having some really fun times playing with those. I think I've seen a company called Veritone One do something with synthetic voice to take an on-air personality's voice and replicate it so that they can do local weather and traffic in multiple markets based on the voice of the actual on-air host. So that's really interesting. I think iHeart is doing that in some markets. Also, we at Sirius are using AI to create ad copy for small and medium businesses so that we can geo-target that into some of our streaming inventory for Pandora. And then just our day-to-day workflow, our CEO, Jennifer Witz, we just had an all hands, and she rolled out a company-wide account for ChatGPT and encouraged everyone. She said, not using AI is like not using a computer. Everybody should be using this to just maximize their productivity, even if it's so much easier to edit a document than to start from a cold white page. And if it comes from bits and pieces of other things that you've done, it can just save you so much time and really help you hone in on the essence of what you're trying to say. So those are the ways. And I personally use something called Claude. It's kind of a better writer than ChatGPT, I've found, but it's just for day-to-day stuff.
Those are incredible tips. That's part of why people tuned in to watch all of you, the experts today. Thank you for joining us for this Global Online Content Series, episode 4. Sarah Van Mosel, Geoff Lloyd, Michael Fischer, and of course, as you can see, Pedro is one of those who thinks it was brilliant stuff.
Thanks, Pedro.
We appreciate that, and thank you for It's not too early for you, Pedro, up in Canada, but thank you for getting up and staying through with us. The other thing is, of course, a lot of people watch this on demand. It was great having you here, all of you. And thank you to SoundStack for making this possible. See you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.